Alright, so for the second video of today, as I mentioned, I will be doing an emotion index because, it is September, and usually when it's near the end of the month or the start of a new month, I will be doing an emotion index, looking at how every fan base in MLS feel about their team up to this season. And we're also getting pretty close in terms of the home stretch of the MLS season. I believe for most teams, they got about 11, 12, or even 13 games left of this season. So with that being said, in terms of this home stretch, we'll see if some of these fan base might feel like, things are going so well that, I can't wait until playoffs actually begin so we can potentially be the one to reach MLS Cup this season. Or in the second tier of the fact that, things are definitely going well and that they are definitely going to be a playoff team. But there is definitely something to be worried about heading into the home stretch, and especially when you do get into the playoffs. The middle tier, as always, it's kind of like the mediocre tier, but at least we're still in the playoff hunt, and we're kind of like in the bubble fighting a couple of teams to make it to the playoffs. The fourth tier is that, yeah, things are definitely not going well, but hey, we're still hanging in there, and we still have maybe an outside shot of being in that playoff picture and making the playoffs. The fifth tier, as always, it's the panic tier. It's the tier where no team wants to be right now. And then I also have a special sixth tier, and usually when we get to this part of the season with some of these teams that is at the very bottom of their respective conference, they're pretty much below in the spot where, yeah, it's we're done and we're pretty much in see you next season mode. And speaking of which, the first team I'm going to put in see you next season mode is Austin FC. And, when you look at the playoff picture, there's definitely certain team in the Eastern Conference that also belong there. But when you look at the Western Conference, even the team that is dead last right now, which is the Houston Dynamo, they're only 8 points out of the playoffs, and with about 11 games left, it's still doable to potentially make up 8 points. But, for Austin FC, who I think they're also 8 points back of the standings, the reason why I kind of want to put them in that spot is that, unless if they can figure out their goal scoring issue, which, surprisingly, they actually have been able to figure things out because, these last 2 games they have been able to score goals. But the problem is they've also started to concede goals in the other end. And, I hate to say this, but Austin is starting to really kind of reminds me of FC Cincinnati in their inaugural year, where as soon as, they are able to score goals, immediately on the other end they're kind of start leaking goals. And we'll see whether or not if Josh Wood eventually is going to find a balance to this team, where eventually this will be a team that could be effective going forward, but also could once again look sturdy on the defensive end. And I also will say that maybe the reason why they have been leaking goals isn't just because their defense have not been good this season, but also because of the recent bad form that Brad Stuver has been. I mean, I think when you look at this Austin FC side, as much as they haven't conceded a lot of goals this season, that defense and that backline actually isn't as good as what you think it is. I mean, I think a lot of the reason why Austin has been able to keep teams off the scoreboard, or at least keep teams from scoring against them, is the fact that Brad Stuver was just incredible in the season. And we also talk about how those so-called MLS expert making those mid-season award and even award Brad Stuver as the goalkeeper of the year. But ever since that was the case, yeah, it just feels like it's been kind of a curse to Brad Stuver, and he's been making some mistakes that definitely is probably going to take him out of the contention of being the goalkeeper of the year. And hence that's why Austin have just not been able to look as sturdy on the defensive side as they have been in the beginning part of the season. But hey, at least they're started to score goals, and one of their big signings recently in Sebastian Jerussi has really started to fit well with this team. But again, I just think that with the way that they cannot find a balance in terms of able to score goals, but also keep it tight on the defensive end, they're kind of in that territory where we're done, and it's pretty much see you next season mode, and find out what can they do to fix in terms of the things that they got wrong in their inaugural season. But now moving on to the New York Red Bulls, and for the Red Bulls, yeah, they're going to be in this tier. And they're not quite in the see you next season mode, but I'm pretty sure their fans are freaking out right now because of the fact that, yeah, I mean, this team all of a sudden are starting to lose at home. And, I talked about this season for the Red Bulls. One of the things that they have kept themselves into playoff contention is that at least they've been doing what the bare minimum you need to do to be a playoff team, which is make sure you get all 3 points at home and also maybe at times get like a point on the road to keep you in the playoff race. But unfortunately, that's just not been the case for the Red Bulls. They've been dropping points not only on the road, but also now started to drop points at home. And when you do both of that at the same time, it's no wonder they are in the position that they're in right now. And like I said, I feel like this might be finally the year where the Red Bulls could not make it to the playoffs for the first time in 10 years. And the writing was kind of on the wall when you look at these last couple of seasons where the new next generation of players coming out of the Red Bulls Academy has not been as good as the one that was in the previous generation. And when that happened, you're gonna expect some problems and maybe you could also say that some of these players might not be ready in terms of coming out of the academy of the Red Bulls and immediately perform in the first team. Now, moving on to the New England Revolution. Yeah, the Revs are still going to be right here at the top. And yes, they did suffer their first loss in what feels like a very long time because, every single week the Revs just always get 3 points and pretty much pulling away from the rest of the Eastern Conference and also the Supporters' Shield standings. And, they, as I mentioned, they suffered their first loss in what seems like forever against NYCFC. But I don't think there should be panic at all in the Revs fan base. I mean, in fact, I think there should be still very happy. And, you can't win every single game. Like, that's just kind of the way it is in MLS. I mean, actually, not even in MLS, but pretty much in almost every single league. It's almost impossible to try to win every single game and go an entire season unbeaten. And the run that the Revs have been on has still been just incredible by MLS standards, even with the recent loss. And now it's going to be interesting to see how they, of course, will bounce back. And I think that's what's going to be the important thing for this Revs team is, can they, of course, bounce back from their first loss in many games? And, usually when a team does go on a long winning streak, it can be hard in terms of trying to take a loss and trying to bounce back the next game because you never had that feeling of coming off of a game in a loss and now you have to find a way to try to bounce back and move on into that tough loss. So let's see if the Revs can, of course, do so. And also, I would like to say that they could potentially do that because one of their main talisman of that team, that is Carlos Hill, who you almost forgot that he actually was not playing for this Revs team or playing for this Revs team for these past couple of games because he's on the IL because of how good New England has been. But now he's back into the roster. Expect this Revs team to be even better than what we have seen in these last couple of games. But now moving on to the Vancouver Whitecaps. Yeah, the Whitecaps are going to be right here where, yeah, things are definitely going well for the Whitecaps. And it feels like ever since they, of course, signed Ryan Gault to this team has been up in a upward projectile. And in some way, I feel like the Whitecaps have kind of experienced similar fate to what the Quakes were experienced, where how the Quakes, they started this unbeaten run where they draw so many games in a row, but finally they started to get wins, and therefore they were able to keep their unbeaten run. This is the same case for the Whitecaps. I mean, their unbeaten run is now at 9 games, and what's now more important about this unbeaten run that they've been on is that they're starting to win games. And because of the fact that they're starting to win games, it's also no surprise that they are literally right there in terms of trying to get themselves above the red line. In fact, they're the first team looking outside in, and I won't be surprised if they can keep this unbeaten run going. This team will definitely be one that can get above the red line. But now, moving on to the Quakes. And speaking of which, so for the Quakes, I'm going to say they're here. So, again, the Quakes, actually, you know what? I'm going to say they're right next to Vancouver. Because, again, both of these teams, in terms of their unbeaten run, are very similar, where it started off their unbeaten run by getting tons of draws in a row. But eventually they started to kind of win games and get themselves into playoff contention. And, for the Quakes, as much as I've been frustrated with them having so many draws lately, it is definitely welcoming to see the fact that they're starting to get wins. And I will also say that coming into these next couple of games for the Quakes, the good news for them is that they actually do have a lot of easy games in their last 13 game of the season. I mean, I think when I look ahead of the schedule, only three teams that they're going to be facing in the next 13 games is actually above the red line, and one of them is going to be the team that they're going to be facing this upcoming week against the Colorado Rapids. But they do play a lot of teams that is below the red line and a lot of team that is around them, which, it's good that they are able to play those easy teams, but also it's maybe kind of a blessing in disguise knowing the fact that, yeah, those games are going to be very important, because especially the fact that, I think the Quakes do play against the Whitecaps twice, both at home and also on the road. Those games could be huge. And the same goes with when they do play against LAFC, which is also a team that they're going to be play twice. And I think they're also going to be playing the Portland Timbers at least one more time in the same with RSL. Yeah, those are the team that when the Quakes do play, those are really playoff kind of matchup that the Quakes are going to get themselves into the playoffs. So in some way, it's great the fact that the Quakes have an easy schedule, but also the fact that they got some really important games. And as good as this 10-game unbeaten run is, I really hope it not only can keep going, but also let's just hope that they when they do face against those teams that they're fighting to potentially make the playoffs, they actually get wins on them. Because if they do get draws against them, I'm not going to be happy about that, because as I mentioned, as much as draws basically hurts the team a chance to get themselves higher in the standings, because draws doesn't really help when you have teams around them that gets win. But also when you look at the tiebreaker, and that if there is a case at the end of the season where there could be a tiebreaker to see who makes it the playoffs and who does not, wins is the first tiebreaker. And right now, when you look at how many draws that the Quakes have got, that is going to be a problem. And also, I would like to say that's the same problem for the Whitecaps too. They've drawn so many games and haven't won a lot of them. If there is potentially a tiebreaker, it can definitely come back to haunt them with the amount of draws they have this season. But now moving on to the Chicago Fire. So for the Fire, I don't know. It's still kind of almost to be determined, and in some way, I don't want to say it's kind of like their playoff hope is on a lifeline, but in some way it is. I mean, when you look at how I mentioned this 5-game road stretch really define their season, it kind of does, because if they do not do well in this 5-game road stretch, they could potentially find themselves be either here or here, where it says they're pretty much in see you next season mode. Now, the good news is they did win a game doing this 5-game road stretch and got a huge 1-0 win against the Red Bulls, but it's going to be interesting to see, can they of course keep it going in their next 2 games. And I expect to finish off this 5-game road trip that they have in these next 2 games. I don't expect the Fire to get maximum points in both of those games, although if they do, then they definitely are right back in terms of a team that could be in a playoff conversation in the Eastern Conference. But if they aren't able to win those two road games, and once again they start to struggle again at home, yeah, this is a Fire team that unfortunately it's another frustrating year for Fire fans to have to deal with. So yeah, this is a team that I would say they're kind of right around here, where things are not going well, but at least they still have an outside shot in terms of making the playoffs if they can win these next couple of games. But now moving on to FC Dallas, and for Dallas, yeah, they're going to be right here, where again, this is another team where they're right in the mix of it, even though recent form they haven't been as good as they have been a couple months ago, where they were really a threat to potentially get above the red line. But they did get a huge win against Austin FC in this Copa Tijas, and that win hopefully will give them momentum in terms of making a playoff push. But again, this is another team that if they want to make the playoffs, they might have to face or might have to fight like 4 or 5 teams in terms of getting themselves above the red line, because there is a lot of team right now in the Western Conference where I think there's only like 3 points different between 6th through 12th place right now, or 6th through 11th place right now in the Western Conference. That's how tight right now the Western Conference is in terms of the playoff race, and it's it's only going to continue to heat up as we get to the latter part of this season. But now moving on to Orlando City. So for Orlando, they're going to be right here. So for Orlando, things are still going well with the team. The team is still picking up points and are still able to get themselves in a good playoff position where they could potentially host at least one home game at Exploria Stadium. But the offense has started to dry up. And there is definitely got to be a lot of concern. If you're an Orlando City fan, seeing this offense start to dry up and seeing the goals that are not being there. I mean, it's been a while since this team has been able to score more than one goal. And you could also say that, Orlando is kind of like the Minnesota United of the Eastern Conference right now. Because, like the Loons, how they have been struggling in terms of scoring goals, but somehow are able to stay themselves afloat because they have a shutdown defense. It's the same thing for Orlando City, which is a team that struggle to score goals, but at least they have a shutdown defense to keep them afloat in the playoffs. And, in some way that could be a good recipe to have, but it's also get to a point where I think their fans are pleading to hope that this team can get back to the form that they had last season. Because this Orlando City team from last season, remember how I talked about how last season under Oscar Pereira for Orlando City, they're such an entertaining team. That's not the case this season. It seems like this season Oscar Pereira seems to be a little bit more pragmatic with this team. And, even though if you're pragmatic, if you're still getting result, I think it is a positive sign. But I can also understand maybe some Orlando City fans are kind of frustrated because of the lack of goal scoring, and they just worry if the goals continue to dry up like this. When they do get to the playoffs, if you can't score goals, you are probably not going to go very deep into the playoffs. But now moving on to Montreal. For Montreal, yeah, they're still going to be right here where things are definitely going well. But obviously the big question about Montreal is, can they continue to punch above their weight? I mean, this has been a team that you talk about, a team that has punched above their weight. Montreal is definitely one of these teams. But the question is, can they, of course, continue? I mean, can this team continue to have players that have clearly overachieved this year and maybe make a playoff push? And if they can do that, then this is going to be an impressive season. And I think Wilfred Nancy definitely could be deserved some Coach of the Year nomination with the way that he has really turned this team. That everybody thought that this was supposed to be a team that's going to finish at the bottom of the Eastern Conference, and now they're fighting for a spot to potentially make the playoffs this season. But now moving on to DC United. So it's the same thing with Hernan Losada, who, I know I've said before that I kind of cursed DC a little bit by giving Hernan Losada the Coach of the Year award in my mid-season ceremony, and that after I award Losada as the Coach of the Year in that video, DC has basically went on a terrible run. But they did get that huge victory in the last game against the Philadelphia Union, and quite frankly, this is probably the most entertaining team to watch. Like, every game that I've seen for DC in these last couple of months has been something that is just incredible to watch. And yes, even though at times they aren't able to pick up resort, they're just a team that, as a neutral, it's a very entertaining team to watch. But at the same time, if you're a DC fan, as entertaining your team is playing, and as much as I know a lot of DC fans are very happy that they're playing entertaining soccer and are just completely almost forgotten what was it feel like those dark days that was last year under Ben Olsen, where they were playing some of the most negative soccer you can imagine. There is still a concern that they're not picking up as much points as they hope to play in this beautiful brand of soccer. And again, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what kind of style that you play. If the style that you play is good but you can't get points, that is the big issue. And I also feel like that's something that maybe some fans might not get, where style does not actually earn you points. What earns you points is able to be the team that score the most goals after the 90 minutes. And for DC, there's been time after time where they play beautiful brands of soccer but are unable to put the ball into the back of the net. And at the end of the 90 minutes, because of also the other reason why DC have also been kind of leaky at the back in these last couple of games, is because of the style that they like to high press. Teams basically just easily play over the top or counter attack them, and they just leave themselves kind of exposed. And that's why their defensive record has not been as good as we've seen in previous year. But now moving on to the next team, which is FC Cincinnati. Yeah, Cincinnati, they're in this category where it's kind of like see you next season mode, and in some way it was kind of see you next season mode when we got when we were back in May, where when you saw this team kind of was falling apart. But then you kind of also had some hope that, you know, with them going on a good run back in June, started to get themselves closer above the red line, and yeah, that seems like it was all for false hope, and this team has felt apart again. And you know, the last game was probably just a or a very typical kind of FC Cincinnati performance, or maybe just kind of a game that summarized Cincinnati's season, or even summarized FC Cincinnati as a team ever since coming into MLS, where just as you thought that there was hope that they can of course get something going, and yeah, they just make some dumb mistake, and you know, this time of course was goalkeeping mistake that they made in a span of just 2 minutes, and there you have it. They lost that game against Columbus and are really now in the territory where it just feels like they're done. Like there's really no way back for this team. They're just way too far out of a playoff picture to even get themselves in. And right now, the only thing that I think FC Cincinnati will hope this team will do is at least not win the wooden spoon for the third year in a row. But now, moving on to the Galaxy. So, for the Galaxy, they're going to be right here. And again, for the Galaxy, things are still going well with this team. But the big problem with this team is that they definitely are hoping their main talisman, Chicharito, eventually is going to be back with this team. And also the fact that there are times where they have looked very leaky at the back. And we know that this is not a big surprise, because, you know, throughout this season and really throughout these last couple of seasons, this has been the biggest problem for the Galaxy, where there always tends to be very leaky at the back. And at least this season, a lot of the reason why they haven't conceded as much goals as they have done last season is because Jonathan Bond has been playing out of his mind, and he's definitely getting some votes to potentially be the newcomer of the year. But yeah, you know, the Galaxy, there's no doubt that they want their talisman Chicharito back as soon as possible. Once again, scoring the goals, because yeah, you know, when you look at this team, yes, they are still near the top of the Western Conference, but you just kind of feel like some of these games that they've played, they have not looked good, especially when they do play against tough teams, like let's say maybe against Seattle or Sporting KC, and how they aren't able to get wins against them. Yeah, that's going to be an issue if they want to make a deep playoff run heading into this season. Now, moving on to Minnesota. So for the Loons, yeah, they're going to be right here. And, you know, it was so big that they, of course, were able to get a win against Houston, because if they didn't get a win against Houston, I would say they're going to be right here, or maybe even almost right here, where, yeah, this is starting to look bad for this team. I mean, you know, I know in the standing wise, you might not think this team is in deep trouble. In fact, you could even say that I shouldn't be complaining about the Loons, with the way that ever since that 0-4 start, they actually has tied SKC for the best points per game total ever since that 0-4 start. So you're thinking, why am I still complaining about this team? Well, this team can't score, and with the way how this team cannot not score, and they don't have really a guy that can score goals besides Robin Lod, who, by the way, is not going to be returning to this team until at the earliest in September. This is definitely a big issue. Now, the good news is, at least in the last game, you know, the reason why Minnesota was able to beat Houston was because of Adrien Hunou, which is a guy that I've mentioned time and time again. He needs to get going, and I'm just really hoping that he's going to be the guy that get things going for this team, because if he can get going, and let's say if Reynoso does come back into this team and be back to his old self, then yeah, this team could definitely challenge himself in terms of being a top 4 team, and maybe once again get at least one home game at Allianz Field. But if that's not going to be the case, then I am going to continue to be very concerned about this team. And it just kind of feels like this is a team that, as much as I know some people might say it's an MLS Cup contender, I don't see it. All I see is this team could be a fringe playoff team, and they potentially could be knocked out in the first round. And if that's the case, that would be a huge failure. Consider this was supposed to be the season to build up last season after them getting to the Western Conference Final, and to have this kind of a setback after them spending so much money to improve their team. It will really be a huge disappointment if this team once again cannot go deep into the playoffs. But now moving on to the Portland Timbers. So for the Portland Timbers, they're right here. Although, as I mentioned in the news of the week after they found out that Eric Williamson is done for the season, I think some of the Timbers fans that they're probably here, or maybe some of them are here where they are definitely panicking because they just lost one, if not their best player here in for the rest of the season, and now they face a situation where they have to once again and find a way to get points, even though Eric Williamson is not going to be available for the remaining of the season. Now, I did say also in the News of the Week episode that, if there is maybe some glimmer of hope, last year when the Timbers did not have Blanco for the rest of the season, at least they were still being a very decent team and looking very dynamic going forward. So, maybe they could do it again this year. And not to mention the fact that they got that huge victory against the Seattle Sounders in the Cascadia Derby, and a game where they really needed that win. Like, after what has happened prior to that week, where they were just having probably one of the worst week I think Timbers fans have had supporting the team, they desperately needed that one. And I talk about many times, when you win the Cascadia Derby, it can really accelerate your team, and let's see if that's going to be the case for this Timbers team, despite the fact that they, again, lost probably their most important player in Eric Williamson for the rest of the season because of a torn ACL. But now moving on to the Houston Dynamo. Yeah, the Dynamo are also here. And in some way, if there is a team that, if I would have made a we're done and see you next season as soon as my last emotion index, I would say the Dynamo are basically the first team to be in that category. I mean, ever since that long winless run where it reached double digit, they were kind of like in that see you next season mode. And, recently they, of course, just fire Matt Jordan, which, I forgot to put that in the news of the week. But, yeah, they have recently just fired Matt Jordan, which I know a lot of Dynamo fans were demanding that to happen. I mean, they were just so demand that happen. When you watch that game between Minnesota and Houston, you can see a big banner that say fire Matt Jordan, and even their supporter group basically didn't even show up because they were protesting in terms of demanding the team to fire their GM. And finally, that of course is the case. Now, that being said, we'll see whether or not if that can maybe change something and maybe spark something for this Dynamo team. I mean, I still feel like they're kind of like we're done and see you next season mode. I mean, unless if they can be like what the Quakes are, where the Quakes, I think they're kind of like the only team I can remember in recent memory where they fire their GM and then they have an incredible run. But yeah, unless if this Dynamo team doesn't snap out of this winless run, I just think that they're kind of like in see you next season mode. And I think maybe some Dynamo fans are happy the fact that, they would be in see you next season mode. Because right now, I think their goal is not really hoping this team to be decent and make a playoff push. But they're really hoping to get rid of some of those people in the front office and some of those top rank official in their team, so that they can have a fresh start and they can finally have a proper rebuild. But now looking at Atlanta United. So for Atlanta, they're here. And yes, that last game against Nashville does sting. Because, they were in such a good run. And then they had that bit of a setback against Nashville at home, losing them 2-0. And also, not to mention, it also hurt the fact that was Gonzalo Pineda's first game with the team. And you usually want to leave a good first impression. And that game was definitely not the one that he was looking for. But that being said, I still think Gonzalo Pineda is going to do good things with this team, and I just feel like you can maybe say that that game, if there is an excuse I would give Gonzalo Pineda, is that he just become the head coach of the team and he barely really know the team for a couple of days, and just give him times and eventually he's going to transfer this team to be a decent one. And that is kind of the case. I think this is going to be a decent team and a team that I think they could definitely make a playoff push, potentially if they can bounce back after this tough game that they just had against Nashville SC. But now moving on to, let's see, what do we have here? We got Colorado. So for the Rapids, yeah, they're right here. The Rapids, everything is going well with this team, and it just feels like, I think, if there's any doubt that the Rapids are not for real, I think those doubts are all gone. Like, this team is definitely not only a playoff contender, but definitely an MLS Cup contender. And I think maybe the only doubters that we'll say is that, well, let's see how they do against SKC and Seattle, or against the best of MLS. And so far, I will say that that's something that they might still need to prove, because they still haven't got wins against some of the best team in the Western Conference. And unless they do get a win against them, then maybe that will violate themselves as a Western Conference contender. But that being said, the Rapids are definitely for real, and this is definitely a team that if you definitely do not want to face this season than heading into the playoffs. And I know I said that last year, and look what happened. But I really feel like this is even better. That this team is definitely even better than what it is last season. And it's got to be full credit to Robin Fraser, who is another guy that I think could definitely get some recognition of potentially winning the Coach of the Year. But now moving on to the Seattle Sounders. And for the Sounders, yeah, it's pretty easy. They are right here at the top, as it always is, because, it's kind of like that's where the Sounders always belong, where they just can't wait for the playoffs to begin, because they know that they're going to eventually finish in the top part of the Western Conference and going to make a deep run into the playoffs, which is, as I always say, a bad news to the rest of the Western Conference, because the Sounders are kind of like the evil empire of MLS, and a team that has won so much and have been into MLS Cup almost every single year. I mean, I could even say that this team is kind of like the New England Patriots of MLS. Remember how the Patriots always tends to go to the Super Bowl every year, and Tom Brady basically dominate every single year? And while the Sounders don't have that kind of Tom Brady kind of guy, they definitely have a lot of good player. And you could even say Brian Schmetzer is kind of like the Bill Belichick of MLS. Although I will say that Brian Schmetzer, his personality is definitely not like Bill Belichick. I mean, Brian Schmetzer is a guy that you simply just cannot hate, and there's really not much you can find that is bad about him. And yeah, I mean, again, there's not much I have to say about the Sounders, rather than the fact that they are definitely they are on verge of potentially making another deep playoff run. But now heading to Inter Miami. And for Miami, yeah, things are definitely going well for this team. I mean, yes, they are 7 points out of the playoffs. But remember, they have 2 games in hand over the team above them. And with the way that they have definitely become a team that is much harder to beat, and also able to pick up good points against top teams in the Eastern Conference, yeah, maybe they can make a run to potentially get into the playoff conversation. Now, that being said, if they are going to do so, they need to continue this good run, because this good run that they're on is just maybe kind of a mirage, and they once again go on a bad run for the rest of the season. Yeah, then they're definitely going to belong in this category. But if this good run is actually real, and they continue to get points, and especially pick up all 3 points in those 2 games in hand, this team can definitely make a playoff push, which I think that's kind of the bare minimum Inter Miami had their vision coming into the year. And at least these last couple of games have really saved them to be probably one of the most disastrous years that they had heading into the second season in MLS. But now moving on to Toronto FC. And for TFC, I'm going to put them here. I'm not going to say they're done yet, because I still believe that they will eventually get this second half resurgence underway. But that belief is really all hangs in these next two games, or even maybe this next game, where if they can't get wins and start a good winning streak going, or an unbeaten streak going, they're done. Like, they simply are done. And the math is definitely not good for them, but I still do believe some of their talented player. I mean, when you look at this team just looked too good to miss the playoffs. But yet they're kind of one of those teams that just have completely underachieved this year, and that's why they have now got themselves in this spot. And not to mention the fact that they also have been suffering a lot of injury crisis, and in some way kind of proved me right that this team, if they do not have some of their star player, they basically cannot not operate. So yeah, I mean, I do still believe that they have maybe just a tiny hope yet, even though they're going through this free fall that they had. But if they cannot stop this free fall and get things going in these next game or two, they're definitely going to be joining these other three team in see you next season mode. But now moving on to Nashville SC. For Nashville, they're going to be here. And, for Nashville, that was a huge win against Atlanta United. That is a win that definitely can maybe put some of those doubters thinking that, well, yes, Nashville is near the top part of the Eastern Conference, but they have the toughest schedule out of any team in the remaining 1/3 of the season, and we'll see whether or not they can get through that. Well, so far they're off to a good start in terms of getting through that tough stretch, but again, let's see if they can continue to, of course, pick up points on the road or even win games on the road too. I mean, I feel like when you do the math, I feel like they need to still at least win 1 or 2 more road games if they want to at least have a home game at Nissan Stadium, and that is if they win the remaining home game too. Like, if they cannot afford to drop more home points if they are expected to keep themselves in the top 4, because in the East, when you look at the standing wise, it's also pretty tight in terms of the middle of the pack, where teams are just juggling for position, and even though most of the teams might potentially make it to the playoffs, what they're now fighting is trying to get home field advantage and at least get one home game heading into the playoffs. But now moving on to Columbus. Yeah, for Columbus, they're going to be right here. And they could be right here if they didn't win against FC Cincinnati. But at least that win does give them some hope that they can climb themselves back out of this tough run that they've been on, where they have lost 6 in a row. But I will say this. That game against FC Cincinnati, it does give them a lift. But when you look at how they played during that game, it does not give you a lot of confidence that if they play against another team, they would also get all 3 points, because I thought that game they kind of got very lucky, and in some way they might have to thank Kenneth Vermeer kind of gifting them the 2 goals late in the game, and they are going to have to rely on that to continue to get their season back on track. Then that's not a good sign for this Columbus Crew team. So yeah, the verdict is still on them, and we'll see whether or not in these next couple of games, when they do play against teams that is not FC Cincinnati, that just kind of give you free points and find ways to give you free points no matter what. We'll see how they, of course, do against them. But now we got LAFC. And speaking of a team that is underachieving this season and how their fans are kind of freaking out, is LAFC, where things are definitely not going well. But hey, they still have an outside shot, mainly because, again, this is a team that, like what I say about TFC, where this team is just too good to miss the playoffs. Like, when you look at the roster, yes, they're obviously not going to have Diego Rossi because he's now going to Fenerbahce, but even then, this is still a good enough team to make it to the playoffs, and I do believe they will eventually do so. But the issue that this team needs to address is that they got to figure out the scoring issue. Yes, the last game they were able to score goals finally, but we'll see if that, of course, can continue, and especially the scoring issue isn't because of lack of trying. The scoring issue is because of the fact that they just could not be clinical in terms of the finishing, and we'll see whether or not if some of these players, and especially Brian Rodriguez, who really had a fantastic game against the Galaxy and El Tráfico. Let's see if that confidence can really be a way where he can maybe carry the team a little bit alongside with Carlos Vela, who I believe I think Vela is still on the IR right now, but if he does come back from the IR and start playing the way that he is, this team, I think, does still have a chance to make it to the playoffs, even though they're in a really tough spot of potentially have probably one of the biggest failing season we've ever seen for a team that has so much expectation heading into this year. But now moving on to NYCFC. And yeah, NYCFC is kind of right here, where I think their fans probably know that, they can't wait for the playoffs, because that's the measuring stick. Like, as well as this team has played, and as well as, that game against New England could send a statement for the fact that they could be a contender in the Eastern Conference. At the end of the day, the real message is really when they do get to the playoffs, whether or not if they can maybe win a couple of games and finally get past that dreaded second round out of the playoffs, which is a place where they have not been able to get past in their franchise history. And yeah, I mean, I know I always say this to NYCFC fans, and they're probably tired of me hearing, but that's kind of the truth. Like, the regular season doesn't really matter for this team. It's when they get to the postseason where if they don't do well there, then this would once again consider to be a failure of a season, because it just feels like they always get stuck in that fatality of a team that is very good in the regular season, but when playoff time comes, that's when things just kind of fall apart. But now moving on to RSL, and for RSL, they're kind of right here, where they're mediocre, but they're at least in the playoff hunt, and it's really hard to tell on this RSL team. Like, they have been very inconsistent in these last couple of games, where there's times where they can look like a very good team, and then there are times they look like one of the worst team in the league. Now, at least being inconsistent does get you to potentially be a playoff team, but that being said, we shall see whether or not if they when those important games does come in, especially down the stretch, if there is still in that playoff hunt, that's when inconsistent form can potentially hurt you, where you might have to play against a team where you have to get 3 points, and if you're inconsistent and you don't know what RSL would give you if you're an RSL fan, that could be very, very frustrating, because it could be a bad version of RSL, and they might not be able to win that game to get to the playoffs. But that being said, I still think even if RSL doesn't get to the playoffs, I think their fans are still going to be very happy, because again, this is another team that I would say this is kind of like the Montreal of the Western Conference, where I'm pretty sure a lot of their fans have no expectation about RSL this season with the mess that they had heading into this year, and a lot of people predict them finish at the bottom of the Western Conference. And here we are. They're still competing for those playoff spots, and I think they're now the last team in if the playoffs would have started today. But now moving on to the Philadelphia Union, and for the Union, I will say it's here. And in some way, the Union is kind of almost having the same issue that Orlando has, which is, yeah, things are still going well, and we're still picking up points, but the goals have dried up. Like, this team is really struggling in terms of scoring goals and in the attacking end, and especially some of these players that's supposed to carry the attack, guys like Kasper Schmeichel, Jameer Montero, and Sergio Santos, they have not looked good so far for this season, and have definitely, or not this season, but at least lately, because some of them were looking very well in the beginning part of the season, but now it looks like they have looked nothing like that in the beginning of the year, and that is a huge concern if you're a Union fan, because as long as if you're unable to score goals, and especially when you look at some of these results that they've been getting, it's been kind of a mixed bag, and if they can continue this inconsistent run and teams behind them start to catch them up, they could find themselves in a really tough spot of potentially have to fight off a couple of teams to remain in those playoff spots. And even then, if they do get into the playoffs, I just don't think this is a team that I can just say that they maybe will make progress heading in, or progress from last year of not getting knocked out in the first round and make it into the second round, because I just think this team still looked like a fringe playoff team, and a team that unless they can't find the good form that they had in the beginning of the season, this team could be heading into a bit of a disaster, even if they do get into the playoffs. But now moving on to the last team on this board, the last team to put on the Emotion Index is SKC, and yeah, SKC, actually, you know what? I'm not going to put SKC that high. Definitely not as high above Seattle, but I'm going to put them right here, because, I'm going to say things are definitely going well for SKC, but the big question with this team is the fact that they have fallen behind so much this season. And I've said it before this year, as much as I know SKC has been the most resilient team in the league, and they have, I think, had the most points from coming back from a deficit early in the game, they cannot continue to do this heading into the playoffs. Like, recent memories have shown that you cannot be a team that fall behind the 8-ball and expect to always come back, and especially in the playoffs too, where I talk about how goals usually doesn't come that much in the playoffs. If you fall behind the 8-ball early in the game, you could maybe not even get yourself dig back into it. And especially in recent form, where they do fall behind the 8-ball, they haven't been able to do what they have done in the beginning of the season, which is completely come back and able to get all 3 points. In fact, they fall behind the 8-ball, I think, a lot so far in recent home games, going down 1-0, and they only are able to salvage a draw, and at times barely able to salvage a draw to get themselves at least some points at home. But yeah, they continue this kind of form. I just don't think they're gonna do well heading into the playoffs, and that's also kind of concerning, because I also said this is a team that could, if there is one team that can really take on the Seattle Sounders in the Western Conference, it's SKC. But my worries is if SKC do play against the Sounders, and this is also the reason why I'm so excited when they do play against each other at Children's Mercy Park again. And it's going to be interesting to see when both of these teams will have a full strength squad. Let's see how the matchup is going to look like, because, again, I still think that they are the team that could stop Seattle from going to another MLS Cup. But they need to quit that habit of giving up late goals, because I'm pretty sure if they gave up a late goal against the Sounders in the playoffs, the Sounders are not going to let that lead slip. I mean, how many times we've seen the Sounders choke late leads in the playoffs? We barely have seen that happen ever, especially in the playoffs. But yeah, there we have it. That is pretty much it in terms of the emotion index. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the emotion index, and if I put your team a little bit too high or a little bit too low on this emotion index, let me know in the comments below. But until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.